Hi, everybody. John Collins here with a Crime in the Courtroom update for uh, January 28th, 2025. And it is with a heavy heart that I come to you today. And as I get started, I want to mention that we have lost an amazing thinker and pioneer in the history of forensic science. But as I get started here, I want to try to make sure that we start off on the right foot because the gentleman that I'm going to be commemorating today in this update would not want it to be a sad episode of crime in the courtroom. But I think what he would want is for us to use this as an opportunity to be mindful of the people in our careers that mattered to us, the people that in some way, whether it was big or small, made a difference in our lives and in our careers, particularly people, as was the case here for me, people that had a tremendous impact on our professional lives. And I am speaking of the great John Murdock. And for those of you in the forensic laboratory sciences that have been around a while, and maybe some of you that have not, may know John, and many of you have probably never heard of John Murdock, particularly if you're in the early years of your career or you've never really interacted with the folks out in California or in the circles that John used to run in. There was no one in my what is now 32-year history in forensic science, no one that had as positive an impact on me as a forensic science professional as John Murdock. And I hope to explain why that is, because I think it would be helpful in today's era to understand a guy like John Murdock and what was important to him and what it was that he was trying to accomplish with his career, among the many things that he was trying to accomplish with his career. Um, but what made him tick and why there were some things about him that we could use some more of today. For those of you that are watching this on the YouTube channel, you may see me having to pause from time to time as I kind of stop to gather my thoughts because I have not prepared any notes. I have not prepared any outline. I wanted to just sit down here in my office. You'll notice that I don't have the typical studio background. This is my office where I do most of my coaching and my daily work here at Critical Victories. But I most likely am going to have to pause every now and then just to kind of think my way through this. So I hope that you will. I hope that you will understand the reason for that. In order to understand how important John Murdock was to me, I want to just kind of explain what was going on in my career at the time that I met him. I was recruited and hired by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Laboratory in Atlanta in 1996. And as I have written about and talked about, that was during the Olympic bombing investigation, which had a tremendous impact on me. I really didn't know much about John Murdock, and I knew that he was one of the firearm and tool mark examiners for the ATF out in the California laboratory, which was in Walnut Creek at the time. And but up to that point in 1996, although I would say I was a good, competent, reliable firearm and tool mark examiner, I don't. I would say that I did not have the best of mentors, and I did not have mentors that were developing me that had what I would describe as scientific minds. They were not scientific thinkers. I would say that they saw themselves as investigators. They saw themselves as sort of arms of the police helping to get the bad guys thrown in jail. And these were the people that developed me. And I didn't know it. at the time. You only know what you know. The people that train you becomes your reality, the things that they share with you, the principles that they teach you, the methods that they teach you. You make the assumption as a young person that they wouldn't be teaching you these things if it wasn't the right way to do things or the right way to think about things. And it wasn't until I got to the ATF lab in Atlanta, which is now ATFE, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. It wasn't until I got to the ATF lab in Atlanta that my mind just completely opened up to new ways of thinking about forensic science and actually what it means to be a science. That's not a question that I had ever really been confronted with before. And the 2 years that I spent at the ATF lab before I moved up to Illinois, where I eventually became the laboratory director there, I grew up in the Midwest and just kind of felt a pull to go back to the Midwest. But the 2 years that I spent at the ATF lab in Atlanta were two of the most educational, eye-opening, and thought-changing years of my career. If it wasn't for those 2 years with the ATF, I would not have had the career that I have gone on to have. And so I am incredibly grateful, not only for the ATF, but I'm incredibly grateful for our federal agencies out there because of how much they prioritize professionalism. That was something that was just really, it was not lost on me. The priority that was placed on professionalism within the federal agencies. And that had a tremendous impact on me. But I heard about this guy named John Murdock. And John, unbeknownst to me, when I first got to the ATF, I would eventually come to learn this. John was actively involved in what I would describe as a philosophical battle with the status quo in the discipline of firearm and tool mark identification. So again, we're talking the mid to late 1990s here. And John, a firearm and tool mark examiner at the ATF lab, was becoming a leading voice in helping people in the firearm and tool mark community grapple with what it means for a conclusion drawn in the laboratory to justify being called scientific. And what that meant was that if you, for example, get a bullet from an autopsy or a bullet comes into the laboratory from a hospital that was recovered during surgery from somebody who was shot, and the police submit a firearm from a suspect, and you're asked in the laboratory to determine if the bullet recovered from the autopsy or recovered from the surgery did in fact come from or was in fact fired from the suspect's gun. That's kind of a typical request that is made of forensic science laboratories and their firearm and tool mark units. The way that many of us were trained back then and the way that we thought back then was that, well, I get trained to compare bullets on the comparison microscope. I look at these striations or scratches and land impressions on the surface of the bullet. And then through my training and experience, I come to a conclusion as to whether or not that bullet was fired from this particular gun. And that's the way that I thought. And that's the way most firearm and tool mark examiners thought, which meant that the pattern identification sciences, including firearm and tool mark identification, operated in what I would describe as sort of a medical diagnostic model. Right? You go and you see a doctor and you describe some symptoms and the doctor says, look, I think you have strep throat. We're going to do a throat culture, this kind of stuff. And then the doctor makes the official diagnosis. as a patient, you don't walk through a little machine and then there's a printout that says you have strep throat. There's a doctor that has to conclude that. And that we would describe that as a medical diagnostic model. And that's the way a lot of the forensic pattern identification sciences are and were to this day, that it required human eyes to conduct the analysis and draw the conclusions, because we can actually see the evidence that we're looking at, unlike a DNA examiner or analyst that cannot see with their naked eye the DNA strand, or the drug chemist that cannot see with their naked eye the cocaine molecule. And what was so important to John Murdock and some of the folks that he was working with out there in California, which included a guy named Al Biasotti, I can never remember how to pronounce his name, Fred Tulliners, and some other folks out there in California that were taking the lead on this, is they asked a really provocative question. And it was a really simple question, but a difficult one to answer. Is they said, look, on one end of the spectrum, you might say that there is not enough information on this bullet to conclude that it was fired from the suspect's gun. There's just not enough there. We can't rule it out. The land impressions are the same width, it's the same caliber, there's some similarities, but not enough to conclude that it was fired from the suspect's firearm. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have those bullets, which you could practically make the identification from across the room with a pair of binoculars. It's just so pronounced. The pattern of the markings or scratches, we use the word striations in firearms, but these scratches on the bullets. But then there's the question. The question was, okay, so as you start to converge that spectrum, at what point do you reach that spot along that spectrum where you have the difference between an inconclusive result? In other words, I can't make this identification, there's not enough there. Or you can say, yes, I can make the identification. Where is that spot? And that's not something we were talking about or had ever really talked about in the firearm and toolmark community. And it was a really difficult question to answer. And John committed a big chunk of his professional life to trying to answer that question. In fact, I would argue that he did answer that question. And a gentleman that I worked with in the ATF laboratory in Atlanta, a guy named Jerry Miller, who was another fantastic mentor for me, was a part of that movement to identify what they called the criteria for identification, as it was known back then. And they actually were able to come up with one. It was a descriptive term as far as the number of striations or patterns of striations that you would see in identification, but that you would never see in two bullets that were fired from different guns. And this became the criteria for identification. If I recall, I think it was one group of 6 or 2 groups of 3 within close proximity to each other. It was something like that, of striations. It doesn't really matter. But John was fighting an uphill battle, and the way that he never stepped back. He would always listen to people, but he stuck to his guns, so to speak, no pun intended. And he was insistent on the fact that, look, and this is, you got to remember, this was in the wake of the Daubert hearing, which came out in 1993, which I think really inspired a lot of this work that was being done. For you younger examiners out there, this is important history for you to be aware of. The Daubert ruling in 1993 was like a nuclear explosion that went through the forensic science community. And there was an effort to try to really ask ourselves some challenging questions about the scientific roots of our discipline of firearm and toolmark identification. And John was one of the guys taking the lead on this, and he took his lumps. He was criticized. He had to butt heads with some people that thought he was just a California whack job, trying to tell everybody else in the rest of the country how to do their work. But all that John was doing was recognizing that there was a simple question that we could not answer. as a firearm and toolmark community, and by God, he was going to try to answer it, and he wanted the help of as many people as he could possibly get. So I had the opportunity to spend some really good quality time with John when I attended a criteria for toolmark identification workshop that he taught in, I believe it was either in San Francisco or Sacramento. This was a long time ago, with a gentleman named Fred Tolliners, who also did some fantastic work in firearm and toolmark identification. I think has also since passed away. And I could not believe just what a how much I enjoyed this John Murdock guy. And he was different from a lot of from what others the way that others were describing him that I had heard. He was funny, funny as hell. One of the funniest guys I've ever met. He could make me laugh like I can't even begin to tell you. He had a wonderful mix of seriousness and humor and a little bit of self-deprecation and just a little bit of teasing. But he was a guy that I just sort of was drawn to because he wanted to do serious work in a serious way, but he wanted to enjoy it and he wanted to do it with people that he enjoyed. And if there was going to be anybody that was going to get in his way or criticize him, well, then so be it. Then you better tie your boots tight because he was going to be ready for you. He was a wonderful thinker. And you got to understand first of all, and this is huge. John was doing this work and he felt strongly about this work long before things like the National Academy of Sciences, took an interest in forensic science, long before the Innocence Project started, you know, and the Innocence Network started asking questions about these different disciplines, or the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST. John was doing this long before they came along. And he impacted me and opened my mind in a way that I can't think of anybody else that has had as much of a positive impact on me. And we just we're getting ready to watch the Super Bowl here, coming up in the next few weeks, and they'll award their most valuable players. I think all of us in our lives, we can identify a few most valuable players that had the biggest impact on us. And for me, John is at the top of the list, certainly on the professional side. He accelerated my professional maturity by decades in a short period of time, and I am just so thankful for that. And I had one opportunity to spend some really quality time with him. Uh, I know he recognized the interest that I was taking, that I was really fascinated by this stuff. And so he went out of his way to really mentor me and teach me, what it was that we were trying to do here. And back then, we didn't have these fancy photograph cameras that attached to the microscopes, so we had to take photographs and then go into the dark room. And so you had to make sure you got all these settings right on your camera and the lighting right so that you could take your photo paper and develop it and all this kind of stuff. And so he taught me a lot about wet photography back then. And he gave me two books, sent them to me in the mail with really nice inscriptions that I really, really appreciated. And so over the years, it's one of those things where John and I, our careers were always in different phases. He was, 30 years older than me, I suppose. But we really appreciated each other. He knew what an impact he was having on me, and I know he knew how much I enjoyed his mentorship and his sense of humor, and we got together personally from time to time. Although in recent years we didn't speak as much, but he reached out to me. Oh, I don't know, about a year ago, maybe a little more than a year ago, and congratulating me on the release of one of my books. And he said, "Hey, I don't." I'm missing a couple. I see you've written 4 books. I've only got two. Can you send? I'd like to get the other two." And I said, "Oh, John," I said, I said, "I tell you what I'll do. I'll send them to you with an inscription, and it's on me." And he wrote back jokingly, and he said, "John, let me give you a little bit of business advice. You really should have people pay for your books." And so I said, "Okay, John." And so I gave him the amount that I pay as the author, and he sent me a check in the mail with a nice note. I really would like to make sure that in this update and in this commemoration of the life and career of John Murdock, I make it clear what an incredibly valuable role he played in the forensic science community and the impact that he had on a lot of forensic scientists, including me. He was a laboratory director, firearm and toolmark examiner. He was a consultant. He did a lot of different kinds of work. He put on wonderful training workshops. He was a fantastic instructor. And I just want to make sure that for those of you that never had the opportunity to meet him, that probably in some way, whether big or small, you have been impacted and your work in forensic science has been impacted by John Murdock. He was really a fantastic guy. And I'm extremely grateful to my colleague, Eric Collins, out at the supervisor of the firearm and toolmark unit of the ATFE laboratory in, I believe it's in Dublin, California now, for reaching out to me and just letting me know that this had happened, and we're waiting to get word on memorial services. If there's any way that I can get out there, I want to get out there to pay my respects. I'm not, because of my schedule, I'm not sure that's going to be possible, but I'm gonna do my best. And so if I can't, I hope that this episode or this update serves as a fitting tribute to this just incredible guy that I am really going to miss, and that the community, forensic science community, is really going to miss. John Murdock really dedicated so much of his life to doing what he could to make sure that any forensic scientist, particularly firearm and toolmark examiners, which was his area of his interest, we're doing scientifically valid work, we're drawing scientifically valid conclusions, and we're showing up in courtrooms all across the United States and even around the world, delivering scientifically valid, robust testimony. And not simply going in there and saying, "This is the conclusion because I said so." That was just, that was offensive to John. And it's offensive to me. But the reason it's offensive to me is because John helped me understand why that is. And so in the workshop that I teach now for expert witnesses, there's a lot of lessons that I learned from John Murdock that sort of weave their way through that curriculum. So I'm going to close here with just making this final statement and saying that I am profoundly grateful that my path crossed with this guy, John Murdock, out in California, and that he had the graciousness and the interest in me to spend time with me and people like me, to help us be the best that we could be and to give us permission to challenge the status quo and to recognize that, you know what, it's okay to challenge long held beliefs, and it's okay to stand up for what you believe in, even though it may cross some individuals that you might think have a lot of influence and people that it might not seem like it's very smart to cross. But because of John, I really came away with an elevated level of confidence that if you do your homework and if you're curious about the facts and if you're willing to question yourself and question what you do, that you're going to accelerate your development as a professional and certainly as a scientist. and that's exactly what he did. So I want to close by just saying directly to my very dear friend and mentor, John Murdock. John, well done, man. Well done. You had a career like few others, like nobody else, and you impacted so many people. And I'll tell you that there's one guy sitting in his office today in Brighton, Michigan, that is his heart is broken because you had to leave this world, but incredibly grateful for the time that he got to spend with you. You were one of a kind, John, and thank you for your contributions to this amazing profession, forensic science, and our condolences to John's family and his many colleagues out there in California, Contra Costa County, and at the ATF laboratory. We're really going to miss him. Take care, everybody. Thanks.